All right, welcome to how to expense stock options under ASC 718. So you've issued some stock options and now it's time to record the expense. If this is your first time dealing with ASC 718, then you're probably going to be a little confused about all the jargon, and I'm here to help you with that. By the time you get done with this video, my goal is basically to have you conversationally competent around stock option expensing. Now, if you're interested in seeing a behind-the-scenes peek of what an actual stock option expense report looks like and how it's actually generated with Capshare, you can click here to watch that video. But in this video, we're going to talk about how stock option expensing actually works and the principles behind it. So before we jump into that, I've actually got a quick story I'd like to tell you. So there was an old Boilermaker who was hired to fix a huge steamship boiler system that wasn't working well. And after listening to the engineer's description of the problems and asking a few questions, he went into the boiler room. Now he looked at this maze of twisting pipes, listened and thumped on a few on the boiler, listened to the hiss of escaping steam for a few minutes, basically just kind of walked around and got a sense of the situation. And then he hummed softly to himself, just reached into his overalls and took out what looked like a small hammer. And he tapped on a valve, on a bright red valve for a few moments, and immediately the entire system just sprang to life, began working perfectly, and the Boilermaker packed up and went home. Now, when the steamship owner received a bill for $1,000 from the Boilermaker, he was outraged, and he complained to the Boilermaker that there was no way that this could have been $1,000, and he asked them for an itemized bill. And so the Boilermaker sent him the bill that you see right here, and it read that it was 50 cents for tapping the valve, but for knowing where to tap, $999.50. So the point in that whole story is that my goal is really not to turn you into that old Boilermaker of stock option expensing who knows to pull out that bright red hammer and knows exactly where to tap and makes everything look easy. But I'd like to turn you into the engineer who is able to effectively communicate with the Boilermaker about all the particulars about stock option expensing in your situation. That way the Boilermaker can get the job done quickly. And I guess the Boilermaker in this case would be anyone that you hired to do stock option expensing in-house, or if you're using software like Capshare, knowing what to communicate to our team when we help you set up your stock option expensing software so that it's ready to run reports for you whenever you need it. So moving forward in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to use a fairly simplistic example, but just so you know, I'm going to steer clear of most of the edge cases. And the reason for that is that it can get pretty complex. And so you should also know that there are a number of different methods that are acceptable for expensing stock options under GAAP. Now, I'm going to demonstrate just one, but in cases where there are multiple possibilities, I'll try and point them out. That way you can learn about them on your own if you're so inclined. Okay, so a general overview of expensing an option. So the process of expensing a stock option can be broken down into two distinct steps. One is calculating the fair value of the option, and two is calculating or allocating the expense over the option's useful economic life. So let's walk through an example of these two steps using a very specific option grant. So here we have an option grant given to an employee named Naomi Smith. We've granted her 40,000 shares with a strike price of $2, set the vesting schedule to a 4-year with 25% given on each yearly anniversary. And we have a expiration date, a vesting commencement date, which equals the date that we actually granted it. So our first step is calculating the fair value of the option. Now, fair value has a very technical definition, and it has been defined as the price that would be received to sell an asset or paid to transfer liability in an orderly transaction between two market participants at the measurement date. So the fair value is neither the strike price, nor is it the value of the underlying stock, nor is it the difference between the two. That would be the intrinsic value. No, the fair value is the price at which the option would be purchased in an open market as of the measurement date, or in our case, this is the date that it was granted to the employee. So herein lies the difficulty for all private companies. They don't have options that are bought and sold on a public market. So the option's fair value has to be calculated, and you've probably realized that because you're here now. So there are a couple of methods that can be used to actually run the fair value calculation. One is the Black-Scholes model, another is the lattice model, and another yet still is the Monte Carlo method. But the Black-Scholes is really the easiest and the most straightforward. It's also the most standardly used because of that. And so it's the way that I would recommend you to do it as well. So essentially the Black-Scholes method is a formula with 5 inputs. So you enter in those 5 inputs into a formula, and what happens is it returns an estimated fair value for the option. So those 5 inputs are the strike price, the price of the underlying security or common stock, the term, which is the time to expiration, and the variance or volatility of the price of the underlying security, and last of all, the annualized risk-free rate. So let's figure out what those 5 inputs are in our case. And all the inputs, by the way, are going to be after or as of the measurement date of July 1st, 2015. So the first that we're going to look at is the strike price, and that's easy. We know that that's $2. For the price of the underlying security, we're going to assume that it's $2. Most private companies issue options with a strike price that is equal to the value of the common stock, but really that's going to be determined by your 409A valuation. And so if you have a recent 409A valuation, I would look at that. If you don't and you're planning on issuing options, you're probably going to need to get one. And if you want to learn more about 409A valuations, I would recommend this guide as a great resource. Okay, so next we have the term. So the term represents how long we think the option grant will be outstanding from when it was issued to when it either cancels or exercises. But this is where things can get kind of difficult. Now, often you will see 10 years entered for the term, but we have received guidelines that it should be shorter. And that makes sense because most employees don't wait 10 years to exercise their options. So if you have a really extensive history of exercises, you can look at that as the basis. But most private companies don't have an extensive history. And if you're watching this, you probably won't either. So the recommendation is a weighting between the vesting schedule and the time to expiration. So you can learn more about that method over here, but using it, we end up getting a term of 6.25 years. Another tricky input is volatility. We need to calculate the variance of the company's stock price over time. So we want to know how much the company's stock price has fluctuated by a percentage over the last 6.25 years. Now, if we were a public company, this would be really straightforward. You could just look at trading history, but as a private company, we don't really have anything like that, and that kind of puts us in a bit of a pickle. So what we want to do instead is to look at a set of comparable public companies. So if your company is similar to company A that has a volatility of 30% over the last 6.25 years. And it is also comparable to company B, which has a volatility of 50%, then we can split the difference and use a volatility of 40%. So the last input that we need is the risk-free rate. Now this is the interest rate at which you can lend money at with an almost perfect certainty of being repaid. So because the United States government has never defaulted on its debt, it's a standard practice in the industry to use the interest rates on the U.S. Treasury bonds as a proxy for the risk-free rate. Now, if you go there right now and look, you'll see that there aren't bonds that are issued for 6.25 years. But we can weight the interest rates from 5 and 7 year bonds. And what we end up with is, let's say for this example, a risk-free rate of 1.35%. Awesome. So now we have all 5 inputs that we need to enter into our Black-Scholes model. Now the result that the equation spits out is going to be what we call the fair value. Now you can find Black-Scholes calculators online. Here's one that I would recommend that you use that's pretty simple and straightforward. But utilizing the Black-Scholes model, we find that Naomi Smith's option grant has a fair value of $0.818 per share. So now that we know the value per share, we're ready to record the expense. Now Naomi Smith has an option for 40,000 shares at, as we now know, $0.818 per share, and that's a total expense of $32,720. But, and this is a big but, the expense is not recorded all at once. The expense is going to be recorded over the useful economic life of the grant. Now, you may ask, what is the useful economic life of an option grant? Well, it's the period of time during which it is doing its job. And what's the job of an option grant? It's to incentivize and compensate the option holder. So Naomi's grant has a 4-year vesting plan. So this plan, or the lifetime of that plan, is the useful economic life of the grant. So after 4 years, she's able to exercise all of her options as they're fully earned. Now, the most common way to allocate the expense over 4 years is in even increments. Now, this is called straight line allocation method, but an accelerated method can also be used. So an accelerated method in this case would be somewhat analogous to double declining appreciation. So let's go ahead and look at the straight line allocation method to calculate the stock expense for Naomi's grant for the year 2015. So Naomi's option was granted and begins vesting on July 1st, 2015. Now at year end, the grant is going to be 6 months or 12.5% of the way through its useful economic life of 4 years. So 12.5% of the total expense, and remember the total expense is $32,720, but 12.5% of that is going to be $4,090. And that's our expense. So using this straight line method, it is easy to see how much an expense will be recorded at the end of each year. And here's a table that outlines that throughout the entire economic life of the grant. Now, unfortunately, things are not always this simple. In fact, they rarely are. Now, things get straight down ugly complex when you have to deal with employees that quit partway through the year, or when you need to deal with unvested shares. So Naomi's shares vest in 4 annual installments starting on July 1st, 2016. So in a sense, as of the 2015 year end, she really hasn't earned anything. So if she quits her job, let's say December 31st, 2015, she doesn't really have 12.5% of her option grant, right? She's got 0%. So this begs the question of whether we should even record an expense in 2015, or if we should just wait until the options have vested. But the answer to that is that we should still record the expense in 2015, but the expense is not final until the options have actually vested. So in the case where Naomi's employment is terminated before her shares vest at the end of the year in 2015, the expense will be recorded in 2015, but then backed out in 2016. So if Naomi quits before July 1st, 2016, the 2015 financials would show an expense of $4,090, and the 2015 financials would show an expense that backs us right back out of it. But the good news is that once the options vest, the expense is final and never backed out. So even if Naomi were to quit without exercising her options and they were forfeited, the expense for all of the vested options would still stay. Now you may wonder why that is, because it really didn't cost you anything, so why don't we have to back that out? Now the logic around that is that vested options are earned, and the employee has been compensated because they have the right to exercise. Whether or not they did is another story, but you cannot argue that the options were not earned. And they did their job too. The employee stuck around until the options had vested. So it's a common occurrence that employees will leave before their options vest, obviously, but it's also pretty common for companies to back those expenses out when that happens. And because of this, GAAP allows companies, and in fact they used to mandate it, but GAAP allows companies to apply an assumed forfeiture rate to any expense associated with unvested shares that are being expensed. But the great news is GAAP no longer requires this, so it really is easiest just to use a forfeiture rate of 0%. So hopefully you understand a little bit more about ASC 718 than when you started this video. And I know you're probably not the Boilermaker from the story yet, who knows exactly what to do and how to do it and makes it look easy. But if you've made it this far, you at least deserve the designation of an engineer. So as you've probably seen, calculating your stock comp expense yourself can be doable, but you can probably also appreciate why a lot of companies choose to utilize software like Capshare and work with a knowledgeable team like we have to help you kind of get that set up and on the road. In this video, I tried to use the most straightforward example of calculating an option expense, but even then, it's pretty complicated, or at least it can be, and there are a lot of edge cases where the option expense just has to be handled a different way than the way that we did it. So going back to the story of the old Boilermaker, there is a little nuance there that I think is really important, and that's that the Boilermaker's job was made easier by the engineer's ability to effectively communicate the problems and the situation. The old Boilermaker was able to walk in and make quick work of the problem because he already knew a lot of the facts, and the engineer had already educated him on how those were. So likewise, if you enlist the help of someone else, like Capshare and our software, when you're getting it set up, it'll be really helpful for you to actually communicate the nuances and the problems and everything so that we can help you make sure that your software is set up correctly and it's ready to run reports whenever you need it. So I've put together a checklist that should help you to identify anything that's really important to communicate to whoever's helping you with your ASC 718 needs. And if anything in this checklist applies to you, you're going to want to make sure that you communicate it clearly and early on in the process. That way, any edge cases that specifically apply to you can be handled correctly right from the beginning. And this helps to reduce the turnaround time. It just makes the whole process a lot better. And of course, you end up with accurate stock comp expense reports. Okay, and by the way, if you would like to download this list, you can. We've made it available. You can click right here to do that. but we're going to go ahead and go through it here together anyways. So number one, have you ever had any option modifications? So examples of this would include a repricing event where your strike price actually changes for existing options, vesting schedules that were changed, an employee was terminated, but for some reason you allowed their options to continue to vest, early exercise provisions that were added to existing options, or any other changes made to existing option agreements. Number two, have you made any significant changes to the equity incentive plan documents that might affect existing option holders or options? And by the way, increasing the option pool does not count here. Number three, do you have options that were granted to non-employees, like contractors? Number four, do you have any options with milestone provisions? This will be really important. 5, have you obtained an independent 409 evaluation to determine the fair value of your company's common stock at least every 12 months, starting with the date that you first started issuing options? Number 6, have you issued options with a strike price above or below the fair value of common stock? 7, do you have any previous stock option expense reports, or is this the first time that you're doing it? And 8, do you regularly issue dividends for your common stock? So a lot of these are not super common, but the chances of at least one of them applying to you are fairly high. So if you're interested in downloading this list along with a guide on everything that we've talked about, you can click here to get that. But otherwise, I hope that this has been really useful for you. And if you'd like to get a demo of how stock option expensing works with Capshare and how we can help you to run reports literally in minutes whenever you need them, be happy to give you a demo of that as well. Click here to learn more about that, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If this was helpful, like, subscribe, and you can expect more great content like this to come out. Thank you.